Hey, greetings everybody. Gleekon here again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. Stay a while and listen to Chapter 15 of Arthas, the Rise of the Lich King. The last chapter we looked at Chronicles and we saw Arthas finally... He became a Death Knight, so he's fully evil. He's killed his own men. He has necromantic magic. He's fully... I don't know. I don't think he's like completely taken over yet. And he's not the Lich King yet, but he's pretty darn close to. So I also think we're getting really close to the end of this section of the book. The first one I think was called The Golden Boy, and now it's the Bright Lady. If we're going to follow that theme, I wonder if we're going to get continued darkening as we go through our last one or two parts. All right. Excuse me. So what we haven't covered in the book yet is we haven't covered where he goes and finds Frostmourne itself, and then comes back and kills his men, or drives his men forward to kill Mal'Ganis, then kills his men. So we have all that to kind of get to. Let's see if that happens here. Arthas recognized the sound of Muradin's short but heavy stride, even before the dwarf yanked the tent flap back and glared at him. They stared at each other for a long moment, then Muradin jerked his head toward the outside and let the flap fall. For a moment, Arthas was hurtled back in time to when he was a child, accidentally flinging a training sword across the room. He frowned and rose, following Muradin to an area far away from the men. The dwarf didn't mince words.
"You lied to our men and betrayed the mercenaries who fought for you,"
Muradin snapped, shoving his face up to Arthas as best he could from his much shorter height.
"That's nae the lad I trained. That's nae the man who was inducted into the Order of the Silver Hand. That's nae King Tarnis's boy."
"I'm no one's boy," Arthas spat, shoving Muradin away.
"I did what I deemed necessary."
He half expected Muradin to strike him, but instead the anger seemed to bleed away from his old trainer.
"What's happening to you, Arthas?"
Muradin said quietly, his voice holding a world of pain and confusion.
"Is vengeance all that's important to you?" "Spare me, Muradin," Arthas growled. "You weren't there to see what Mal'Ganis did to my homeland, what he did to innocent men, women, and children." "I've heard what he did," Muradin said quietly. "Some of your men have been a wee bit free with their tongues when ale is loose in them. I know what I think, but I also know that I cannot judge ye. You're right, I wasn't there. Like the light, I didn't have to make that kind of decision. But even so, something's happening. Yeah."
Mortar fire and cries of alarm interrupted him. In a heartbeat, Muradin and Arthas had their weapons out and had turned back to the encampment. The men were still scrambling for weapons. Falric was barking orders to the humans, while Baelgun was organizing the dwarves. There came the sound of engagement from outside the encampment, and Arthas could see the press of undead closing in, his hands clenched on his hammer. This had all the earmarks of a coordinated attack rather than a random encounter.
"The Dark Lord said you would come,"
came a voice that was by now familiar to Arthas. Elation filled him. Mal'Ganis was here. It had not been a wild goose chase after all.
"This is where your journey ends, boy. Trapped and freezing at the roof of the world with only death to sing the tale of your doom."
Muradin scratched his beard, his sharp eyes darting about. Outside the perimeter of the camp came the sounds of battle.
"This looks bad,"
he admitted with characteristic dwarven understatement.
"We're completely surrounded."
Arthas stared, agonized.
"We could have done it," he whispered. "With Frostmourne, we could have done it."
Muradin glanced away.
"There, well, lad, I have been having me doubts about the sword. And to speak truly about ye as well."
It took a second for Arthas to realize what Muradin was saying.
"Are you telling me you figured out how to find it?"
At Muradin's nod, Arthas seized him by the arm.
"Whatever your doubts, Muradin, you can't possibly have them now. Not with Mal'Ganis right here. If you know where it is, then take me to it. Help me claim Frostmourne. You said it yourself. You didn't think that Mal'Ganis would like to see me with Frostmourne in my fist. Mal'Ganis has more troops than we do. Without Frostmourne, we'll fall. You know we will."
Muradin gave him an agonized look, then closed his eyes.
I have a bad feeling about this, lad. It's why I've nae pressed on before. Something about this artifact, how the information has come. Doesn't it feel right? But I promised I'd see this through. Ye go gather a few men and I'll find you that rune blade.
Arthas clapped his old friend on the shoulder. This was it.
I'll get that damn rune blade and I'll shove it through your black heart, Dreadlord. I'll make you pay. Close that gap over there, Felric was shouting. Davin, fire!
The boom of mortar fire echoed through the camp as Arthas raced toward his second-in-command.
Captain Felric.
Felric turned to him.
Sir, we're utterly surrounded. We can hold out for a while, but eventually they're going to wear us down. Who? What? We lose in numbers. They'll gain.
I know, Captain. Muradin and I are going to find Frostmourne. Felric's eyes widened slightly in both shock and hope. Arthas had shared the knowledge of the sword and its supposed vast power with a few of his most trusted men.
Once we have it, victory will be certain. Can you buy us the time? Aye, your highness,
Felric grinned, but he still looked worried even as he said,
We'll hold these undead bastards off.
A few moments later, Muradin, armed with a map and a strange glowing object, joined Arthas and a handful of men. His mouth was etched in a frown and his eyes were unhappy, but his body was straight. Felric gave the signal and began to create a distraction. Most of the undead suddenly turned and concentrated their efforts on him, leaving the back area of the camp open.
Let's go,
Arthas said grimly. Muradin barked out directions as he alternately peered at his map and at the glowing object that seemed to pulse erratically. They moved as quickly as possible through the deep snow, where he indicated, stopping only occasionally for the briefest of breaks to reassess. The sky darkened as clouds gathered. Snow began to fall, slowing them further. Arthas began to move automatically. The snow made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. He no longer noticed or cared in which direction he went, simply moving his legs as he followed Muradin's lead. Time seemed to have no meaning. He could have been moving for minutes or days. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Frostmourne, their salvation. Arthas knew it would be, but could they reach it before his men at the camp fell to the undead and their demonic master? Felric had said they could hold for a time. How much longer? To finally know that Mal'Ganis was here at his own base camp and to not be able to attack was...
There,
Muradin said almost reverently, pointing.
It's inside there.
Arthas halted, blinking eyes that were narrowed to slits against the driving snow, their lashes crusted with ice. They stood before the mouth of a cavern, stark and ominous seeming in the snow-swirled darkness of the gray day. There was some kind of illumination inside, a soft blue-green radiance he could just barely glimpse. Bone-weary, frozen as he was, excitement shot through him. He forced his numbed mouth to form words.
Frostmourne, and the end of Mal'Ganis, the end of the plague. Come on.
A second wind seemed to take him, and he hastened forward, forcing his legs to obey.
Lad,
Muradin's voice brought him up sharply.
So precious a treasure won't be just left sitting around for anyone to find. We must proceed with a bit of caution.
Arthas chafed, but Muradin had more experience in these matters, so he nodded, gripped his hammer firmly, and entered warily. The immediate relief from the wind and driving snow heartened him, and they moved deeper into the heart of the cavern. The illumination he had glimpsed from outside proved to be coming from softly glowing turquoise crystals and veins of ore, embedded in the rock walls, floors, and ceilings themselves. He had heard of such luminescent crystals and was now grateful for the light they provided. His men would be able to concentrate on holding their weapons, not torches. Once his hammer would have glowed with enough radiance to guide them. He frowned at the thought, then pushed it down. It did not matter where light to see by came from, only that it was present. It was then that they heard the voices. Muradin had been right. They were expected. The voices were deep, hollow, and cold-sounding, and their words were dire as they floated to Arthas' ears.
Turn back, mortals. Death and darkness are all that await you in this forsaken vault. You shall not pass.
Muradin halted.
Lad,
he said, his voice soft, though in this place it seemed to echo endlessly.
Perhaps we should listen. Listen to what? Arthas cried. A pathetic last effort to turn me from my path to save my people. It's going to take more than ominous words to do that.
Gripping his hammer, he hastened forward, rounded a corner, and stopped in his tracks, trying to take in everything at once. They had found the owners of the icy voices. For a moment, Arthas was reminded of Jaina's obedient water elemental, who had helped her fight off the ogres on that long-ago day before everything had taken such grim and horrific turns. The beings hovered over the cold stone floor of the cavern, made of ice and unnatural essence instead of water, wearing armor that looked as if it had grown of and from them. They had helms, but no faces, gauntlets, weapons, and shields, but no arms. Alarming though they were, Arthas gave these fearsome elemental spirits no more than a passing glance as his eyes were drawn to the reason they had come here. Frostmourne. It was caught in a hovering, jagged chunk of ice, the runes that ran through the length of its blade glowing a cool blue. Below it was a dais of some sort, standing on a large, gently raised mound that was covered in a dusting of snow. A soft light coming from somewhere high above where the cavern was open to daylight shone down on the rune blade. The icy prison hid some details of the sword's shape and form, exaggerated others. It was revealed and concealed at the same time, and all the more tempting, like a new lover imperfectly glimpsed through a gauzy curtain. Arthas knew the blade. It was the selfsame sword he had seen in his dream when he first arrived. The sword that had not killed Invincible, but that had brought him back healed and healthy. He thought it a good omen then, but now he knew it was a true sign. This was what he had come to find. This sword would change everything. Arthas stared raptly at it, his hands almost physically aching to grasp it, his fingers to wrap themselves around the hilt, his arms to feel the weapon swinging smoothly in the blow that would end Mal'Ganis, end the torment he had visited upon the people of Lordaeron, and this lust for revenge. Drawn, he stepped forward. The uncanny elemental spirit drew its icy sword. "Turn away before it is too late," it intoned. "Still trying to protect the sword, are you?" Arthas snarled, angry and embarrassed at his reaction. "No," the being's voice rumbled the word. "Trying to protect you from it." For a second, Arthas stared in surprise. Then he shook his head, eyes narrowing in determination. This was nothing more than a trick. He could never turn away from Frostmourne. Turn away from saving his people? He would not fall for the lie. He charged and his men followed. The entities converged on them, attacking with their unnatural weapons, but Arthas focused his attention on the leader, the one assigned to guard Frostmourne. All his pent-up hope, worry, fear, and frustration he unleashed on the strange protector. His men did likewise, turning to attack the other elemental guardians of the sword. His hammer rose and fell, shattering the icy armor as cries of anger were ripped from his throat. How dare this thing stand between him and Frostmourne? How dare it? With a final agonized sound like that of the rattle coming from a dying man's throat, the spirit flung up what passed for hands and disappeared. Arthas stood staring, panting, the breath coming from his chilled lips in white puffs. Then he turned to the hard-won prize. All misgivings disappeared as he again laid eyes on the sword. "Behold, Muradin," he breathed, aware that his voice was shaking. "Our salvation. Frostmourne." "Hold, lad." Muradin's blunt words, almost in order, were like cold water doused on Arthas. He blinked, startled out of his trance-like rapture, and turned to look at the dwarf. "What? Why?" he demanded. Muradin was staring, eyes narrowed, at the hovering sword and the dais below it. "Something's not right here." He pointed a stubby finger at the rune blade. "This has been too easy. And look at it, sitting here with light coming from who knows where, like a flower waiting to be plucked." "Too easy?" Arthas shot him a disbelieving glance. "It's taken you long enough to find it, and we had to fight these things to get to it." "Bah," snorted Muradin. "Everything I can about artifacts is telling you that there's something as fishy here as the Booty Bay ducks." He sighed, his brow still furrowed. "Wait, there's an inscription on the dais. Let me see if I can read this. It might tell us something." Both of them advanced, Muradin to kneel and peer at the writing, Arthas to draw closer to the beckoning sword. Arthas gave the inscription that so intrigued Muradin a cursory glance. It was not written in any language he knew, but the dwarf seemed to be able to read it, judging by how his eyes flickered across the letters. Arthas lifted a hand and stroked the ice that separated them. Smooth, slick, deathly cold. Ice, yes, but there was something unusual about it. It wasn't simply frozen water. He didn't know how he could tell, but he could. There was something very powerful, almost unearthly about it. Frostmourne.
I thought I recognized this certainly in Calamag, the elemental language,
Muradin continued. He frowned as he read.
It's a warning.
Warning? Warning of what? Perhaps shattering the ice would damage the sword somehow, Arthas thought. The unnatural ice block itself, though, seemed to have been almost cut from another larger piece of ice. Muradin translated slowly. Arthas listened with half an ear, his eyes on the sword.
Whoever takes up this blade shall wield power eternal. Just as the blade rends flesh, so must power scar the spirit.
The dwarf leaped to his feet, looking more agitated than Arthas had ever seen him.
Look, I should have known. The blade is cursed. Let's get the hell out of here.
Arthas's heart gave a strange wrench at Muradin's exclamation. Leave? Leave this sword behind, hovering in its frozen prison, untouched, unused, with such vast power to offer him? Power eternal, the inscription had promised, along with the threat of scarring the spirit.
My spirit is already scarred,
Arthas said. So it was. It had been scarred by the needless death of a beloved steed, by the horror of watching the dead rise, by the betrayal of one he loved. Yes, he had loved Jaina Proudmoore. He could say it now in this moment, where his soul seemed to lie naked in front of the sword's judgment. It had been scarred by being forced to slaughter hundreds, by the need to lie to his men and forever silence those who would question and disobey him. It had been scarred by so very much. Surely the marks left by the power to right a horrible wrong could not be greater than these.
Arthas, lad,
Muradin said, his rough voice pleading.
You've enough to deal with without bringing a curse on your head. A curse?
Arthas laughed bitterly.
I would gladly bear any curse to save my homeland.
Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Muradin shiver.
Arthas, you ken I'm a solid one, no given to flights of fancy. But I tell you, this is bad business, lad. Leave it be. Let it stay here, lost and forgotten. Mal'Ganis is here. Well, that's fine. Let him phrase his demonic arse here in the wilderness. Forget this business and let's lead your men home.
An image of the men suddenly filled Arthas's mind. He saw them. Beside them he saw the hundreds that had already fallen to this horrible plague. Fallen only to rise, unthinking, rotting hunks of flesh. What of them? What of their souls, their suffering, their sacrifice? Another image appeared, a huge piece of ice, the same ice that now encased Frostmourne. He saw now where this chunk of ice had come from. It was part of something larger, stronger, and it with the runeblade inside it had been somehow sent to him to avenge those who had fallen. A voice whispered in his mind, "The dead demand vengeance." What was a handful of living men compared to the torment of those who had fallen in so horrible a fashion? "Damn the men!" The words seemed to explode from someplace deep in his gut. "I have a duty to the dead! Nothing shall prevent me from having my revenge, old friend." Now he tore his gaze away from the sword long enough to meet Muradin's worried gaze, and his face softened slightly. "Not even you. Arthas, I taught you to fight. I wanted to help you be a good warrior as well as a good king. But part of being a good warrior is picking which battles to fight, and which weapons to fight with." He stabbed a stubby forefinger at Frostmourne, "and that's a weapon you'll never want to be putting in your arsenal." Arthas put both hands up against the ice that was the sword's sheath and brought his face to within an inch of the smooth surface. As if from somewhere far away he heard Muradin still speaking. "Listen to me, lad. We'll find another way to save your people. Let's leave now. Go back and find that way." Muradin was wrong. He simply didn't understand. Arthas had to do this. If he walked away now, he would have failed again, and he couldn't let that happen. He had been thwarted at every turn. Not this time. He believed in the light because he could see it and had used it, and he believed in ghosts and the walking dead because he had fought them. But until this moment he had scoffed at the idea of unseen powers, of spirits, of places or things. But now his heart racing in anticipation and with a yearning, a craving that seemed to gnaw at his very soul. The words came from his lips as if of their own accord, laced with his dreadful wanting.
"Now I call out to the spirits of this place,"
he said, his breath frosting in the cold, still air. Just beyond his reach, Frostmourne hung suspended, awaiting him.
"Whatever you be, good or ill, or neither, or both, I can feel you here. I know you are listening. I'm ready. I understand. And I tell you now, I will give anything or pay any price, if only you will help me save my people."
For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. His breath frosted, faded, frosted again, and cold sweat dotted his brow. He had offered everything he had. Had he been refused? Had he failed yet again? And then with a low groan that made his breath catch, a sudden crack ran up the smooth surface of the ice. It raced its way upward, zigzagging and spreading until Arthas could barely glimpse the sword it held within its heart. Then he was stumbling backward, clutching his ears at the sudden loud cracking noise that filled the chamber. The icy casket encasing the sword exploded. Shards flew across the chamber, swords themselves sharp and jagged. They shattered against the unyielding stone floor and walls, but even as Arthas dropped to his knees, his arms flying up automatically to cover his head, he heard a cry suddenly cut off. "Muradin!" The impact of the ice shard had knocked the dwarf back several feet. Now he lay sprawled on the cold stone floor, a spear of ice impaling his midsection, the blood sluggishly flowing around it. His eyes were closed, and he was limp. Arthas scrambled to his feet and hastened over to his old friend and trainer, tugging off his gauntlet. He slipped an arm around the limp form, placing his hand on the wound, staring at it, willing the light to come and limn his hands with the healing energy. Guilt racked him. So this was the dreadful price, not his own life, but that of a friend. Someone who had cared for him, taught him, supported him. He bowed his head, tears stinging his eyes, and prayed, "It's my folly, my price, please." And then, like a familiar caress from a loved one, he felt it. The light raced through him, comforting and warm, and he bit back a sob as he saw the glow again begin to embrace his hand. He had fallen so far, but it wasn't too late. The light had not abandoned him. All he needed to do was drink it in, open his heart to it. Muradin would not die. He could heal him, and together they... Something stirred at the back of his neck. No, not the back of his neck. The back of his mind. He looked up quickly and stared in wonder. It had flung itself free to embed itself in front of him, its blue-white runes enveloping it in a cold and glorious light. His own light faded from his hands as he rose to his feet, almost hypnotized. Frostmourne was waiting for him, a lover needing the touch of the desired one to waken to full glory. The whispering in the back of his mind continued. This was the path. It was foolish to trust in the light. It had failed him repeatedly. It had not been there to save Invincible, had not been enough to stop the inexorable march of this plague that was on its way to wiping out the population of his kingdom. The power, the strength of Frostmourne, that was the only thing that could stand against the might of a dreadlord. Muradin was a casualty of this awful war, but hopefully his sacrifice would be the last. Arthas got to his feet and took unsteady steps toward the radiant weapon, his hands still wet with the blood of his friend, outstretched and trembling. It closed on the shaft, and his fingers curled around it, fitting it perfectly, as if the one was made for the other. Cold shot through him, shivering up his arms, spreading over his body and into his heart. It was painful for a moment, and he knew a hint of alarm, and then suddenly, it was all right. It was all right. Frostmourne was his, and he was its, and his voice was speaking, whispering, caressing inside his mind as if it had always been there. With a cry of joy, he lifted the weapon, gazing at it in wonder and fierce pride. He would make things right. He, Arthas Menethil, and the glorious Frostmourne that was now as much a part of him as his mind or his heart or his breath. And he listened intently to the secrets it revealed. All right, so we technically could have read that one after the last Chronicles. For the most part, I mean, and we're still ahead. Like he still needs to go back, kill his own men. That's basically what's left, and we're caught up with Chronicles. But I think the wrapping up, there's one last chapter in this part, and I think it spans a lot of stuff happening. Like, I think it spans basically everything else that happens in the Third War, so the entire Undead campaign. I think it condenses all of that into one. So while we did like this human campaign spread out throughout a lot of this, I think that the whole next Undead campaign, and he's not really part of the second half that much. So I think the next book would then go into detail doing the expansion to Warcraft 3. All right, so we got another episode in the pipe, 5x5. Thanks, everybody, so much for watching, for listening. I really appreciate you all. And I'll see you next time on Lore of Warcraft.